So welcome to this Kerry Health and Nutrition Institute webinar on the future of food. KHNI was established in 2015 with the objective of sharing the science of healthier food within the food industry. Our topic today is the future of food. I think a question that has probably never been more interesting or certainly more contested than it is today. We come to this question with a very distinguished faculty in alphabetical order. Dr. Zane Andrews is Professor of Physiology at Australia's Monash University, where he's also Deputy Head of the Biomedicine Discovery Institute. One of his particular interests is in the why and how the brain promotes overconsumption of highly palatable, energy-dense foods and how this contributes to obesity. From Kerry, we're joined also by Dr. Laura Collins, who's RDNA Director for Cognitive Health at Kerry. Laura has previously worked on the link between nutrition and health and the area of proactive health and the licensing of technology in those areas into Kerry. Dr. David Dunn is an entrepreneur, CEO and founder of Hexus, a technology company that seeks to transform how every athlete in the world fuels their performance. Very interestingly, David describes himself as a performance nutritionist and a human performance designer. David, that sounds pretty cool. You can design my performance if you like. And he's worked across a range of sports at the highest level, including cycling with the legendary Bradley Wiggins, rugby with the second best rugby team in the world, Harlequins.
We'll see at the weekend.
And golf with the Irish legend Rory McIlroy. Dr. Lisa Ryan is head of the School of Sports Exercise and Nutrition at Atlantic Technological University, which Lisa joined in 2015 from Monash University. She's an expert in concussion management in sports. And Lisa's particularly interested in the connection or the impact of nutrition on concussion recovery. Dr. Ryan currently leads quite an amazing 6 European projects in sports exercise and nutrition. And again, from an exceptional point of view, supervises a team of 9 PhD students. I'm Damien McLaughlin, the host today, and I'm the Cunningham Professor of Marketing at the Smurfit Business School. Laura, I might start with you and with maybe with the starter question for the novices as well as the many experts who are joining our call. Why exactly do we eat?
So, Damien, is actually quite a multifaceted answer. So, there's the physiological reason of why we eat, which is very simply to get nutrition into the body, energy into the body. But then there's so many other factors also involved, such as social norms, sitting with your family, baking bread over dinner, or there's also the pleasure aspect. So, eating actually rewards pleasure in the brain or reward centers within the brain. And then there's also quite a heavy, I would say, influence of trends on eating as well, what is popular at the time. And I think as well, we'll probably cover a lot of those in our conversation as well today.
If we were to think about the balance of the consumer of food today between trendy, I should be eating, this new Dubai chocolate, or my students last week introduced me to maca, I think, as a green coffee. It didn't look great, but they were very keen on it. So the trends versus the fact that actually I need this balance of nutrients to keep myself healthy or to keep myself with energy. What is the balance between those two things today?
I think what we see is that it really does depend on the consumer. So, the consumer may follow a trend, and then you may have an informed consumer that really wants particular nutrients in that as part of the product they're going to consume. And then you also have a responsibility of the food industry there too, to help bring products that are more nutritious to the consumer as well. So, for example, if you've got healthy agers have a distinct set of profiles that they may be following a trend, but then to also ensure that they're fortified with nutrients that support them on their journey. So a really good example of that would be something like an omega. Omegas can be lower in healthy agers, and when you've lower omegas in the diet, it tends to have a predisposition for mild cognitive decline and Alzheimer's and so on. So helping consumers consume the products that they're enjoying but are fortified maybe for their age group or their need is, a responsibility there as well.
I think one of the issues around food, it seems, is that when you start to use words like fortified, people assume that it's not natural and people want to have natural things today. So although the omegas might be something that's important for a person who's aging, maybe their family or their doctor or even the trends that they're observing on social media in particular says, hold on a second, that's something you should avoid. Is that a big issue for us?
Look, I think we probably will get into a little bit more about processing and that side of food,
Yeah.
but I do think there is a need and a desire and a gap for consumers when they need to take high density, high nutrition, high foods at that age group, that there will always be a place in society for that. But it's ensuring that we are delivering clean label, nutritious ingredients that kind of help get past that perceived perception of the product as well.
Yeah. Zaina, I might draw you in here, and thanks for joining us from Australia this morning, our time, I guess this afternoon or this evening, your time. Your research is about the brain and why we eat. What is your view on why we eat today, and how is that changing at the moment?
Well, I think we eat for, again, a couple of key reasons that Laura brought up. Obviously, when we need food, there is feedback and there are biological processes in our body that tell our brain, go out and find food. And actually try and find the food that has the highest energy content in it, because that may be beneficial for you in the long run. So we have that aspect, but we are also acutely aware of all the external stimuli around us, and our brain picks up on that. Our biology picks up on that. So you could be driving down the road and you'll see golden arches. You immediately know what that is, because your brain has made the association between the golden arches and some type of food. So what's driving our food intake is a collective signaling from within our body, and also an awareness of the what's going on in the world around us.
How come these signals from the outside have become so much more powerful, or seem to have become so much more powerful in recent times? You know, evolution of mankind over tens of thousands of years has conditioned the brain to do certain things, and you know, most of the consumer brands that we eat today are less than 100 years old. There seems to be an imbalance here, or maybe a lack of credit we give to ourselves, or maybe over credit towards the marketing of food products. Am I being unfair?
No, I don't think so. I think at the end of the day, when we eat, what we eat is essentially a little bit of reinforcement. Now, and we learn from that reinforcement. So if we're hungry and we get something that's quite tasty and full of calories, we're going to place greater value on that and want that in the future. Now, of course, like you mentioned, we've got this evolutionary pressure to help us seek out the types of food that have the most calories. Now, when we get those, we're also going to get the biggest boost of dopamine. We're going to get the biggest reinforcement associated at the same time. And that's going to drive us towards those high caloric foods in the future. It's a bit like training animals, for example. When you're training a dog, I have a dog, many of you might have a dog. The best thing to train a dog is to not feed it for a while and then give it some food rewards. Food reward and food reinforcement is the most, I guess, omnipresent type of reward that we have in our society.
Lisa and David, you're both dealing with sports people. It seems to me that maybe in this nutrition area, that the area of sport is where it's the bleeding edge of activity, where you got very high performance people. What are we learning about why people eat from the sports world? And whichever you would like to go first, I don't mind.
Yeah, well, I'll pop in and David will
Thanks.
certainly follow. But I think when you're dealing with sports individuals, you know, particularly if you deal in elite sport that David and I would both have been involved in over the years, you're dealing with essentially freaks of nature. You know, when you're elite, you're the top of the top. And sometimes we'll see people following the behaviours of elite athletes because they want to emulate their success. But what makes them elite and what makes them almost superhuman means that maybe they process something slightly better, or the level of training that they're doing means that they can eat and behave a certain way. Yeah. If the average consumer starts to follow what they're doing, they won't have the same effects if they're not doing the same level of training. What we do see with sports nutrition, I suppose, is we can really begin to understand how manipulations in food and diet, how they can help us excel in certain areas of performance. We've certainly been able to find out a lot about cognition, for instance, in sports individuals through dietary manipulation. And those then do translate into how we change maybe some of the foods that do end up on the consumer shelves.
Yeah. So if I adopted the nutrition habits of Mo Salah, for example, I wouldn't expect to become, you know, the greatest striker in the world, but how far can I go in terms of his physical capabilities, or an average person, not even an old professor like me? How far can you go?
Well, I mean, the fact of the matter is we can train anybody. You know, if you're involved in sports and exercise, we would always say that you can train anybody to change physically and you can feed appropriately to that.
Yeah.
Will you have the same level of success? No. And I suppose another key area, and I don't want to divert too much off topic, but, you know, protein is a prime example of that. You know, people consume protein and assume they're going to build muscle. If you're not doing the training, eating all the protein in the world isn't going to help you build muscle.
That connection often seems to be missing, particularly in social
yes,
media.
Definitely.
Yeah. David, what's...
I'd certainly echo that. Some people that take the field on a Saturday or compete in the best races in the world, they often have physiological advantages that they've developed throughout the course of their life. But I'd also say that I find something quite interesting in athletes, and I often think we put athletes on a pedestal to say, well, they do all of these things and that's why they're the best. But you know, if you look at the research that's come out of Australia from Gary Slater, and more recently in the UK, Megan Bentley, what it really highlights is that there are different things that do influence food choice. And at the end of the day, we're all human. I think what athletes have is they have different levels of motivation. And it was really interesting listening to Zane about, you know, you get motivated by the highest calorie foods and that's going to deliver that level of reinforcement. Whereas for other people, they'll have a goal that they're trying to achieve, and actually their decisions are being influenced by the motivation to achieve that. So I think one thing that grounds both athletes and I suppose everyday people is that the things that drive our motivation are quite similar in terms of, like, let's say the core, you know, are we trying to achieve a goal? Is it something about our own, you know, beliefs about our capabilities? You know, I can lose weight, maybe I can't lose weight. Or is it things in our environment? Just those nuggets, whether it's the golden arches or a picture of Mo Salah, and who's, for a young person who wants to be like Mo Salah, they will have elicit similar effects in terms of influencing choice, but let's say delivering different outcomes. So I think our understanding of, and coming back to your point about marketing, I think what marketing has stayed ahead on is it's understood behavior more than, let's say, nutrition and sports science has understood behavior. We're probably playing catch up to really start to understand what in a social environment, a physical environment, the people are around are starting to influence their choices.
Yeah, given the kind of quasi-academic nature of this panel, the first thing, as a marketing professor, the first thing I would think of is that all of that research is published in marketing journals. So why are nutrition people not reading the marketing journals when it comes to food?
I think naturally you've probably, these different disciplines, they've been siloed, and, you know, nutrition and sports science, everyone lives in their echo chamber. The same practitioners go to the same conferences, read the same papers. Yeah. And I think maybe in more recent years, I can speak for sports nutrition, we've started to push out a little bit. We've started to look at the implementation science research and maybe what's happening in UCL or what's happening over in Northwestern University. But up until now, it really has been an echo chamber. And I just think it's a reflection of sports nutrition as an industry. You know, it's quite a young industry and it is evolving. But there's no good reason apart from people haven't looked outside of the obvious.
Yeah.
And maybe, Damien, to
thanks,
follow on from that point, I think it's so important then when you have consumer insights that we would work with a lot in Kerry, understanding the consumer and then trying to translate that into actionable insights. And I think the Kerry Health and Nutrition Institute also do that quite well, because it's taking both sides of that. You know, we're working with academics, we also have our own consumer research in-house. Example, we just did a GLP consumer research recently that really does help both sides of the understanding, because, you know, we always say taste is king. You know, the consumer won't reconsume if it doesn't taste good. So those insights really do help to actually bring it as an actionable insight to a consumer as well.
Yeah, and I think interestingly within marketing, I think the study of health more broadly, not specifically about sports, that's exploding also in terms of research grants and so on in supporting new research. Laurie, your particular expertise is in aging, and everybody is very excited by sport. Most of us are very excited by sport of some kind or another, and I guess most of us have participated in sport. And of course, we know these kids when we were in school who were the brilliant athletes and so on. Some of them made it, some of them didn't. But one of the absolute immovable trends in the future of food is the aging, particularly of the Northern Hemisphere population, probably certainly the richest generation of all time. What do we know about aging and why we eat and how that changes. And it seems to me that, what David and Lisa are saying is that in principle, you can train anybody to do anything. They got to do the exercise and they got to do the nutrition part, and they can achieve certain things. But it seems that when aging, there's two parts to it. There's the physical thing to maintain lean muscle mass, but also there's a cognitive part, which I know you have particular expertise in. So could you lay out the landscape for us in terms of the future of food around aging, what it looks like, and then how it impacts on those two areas of cognition and physical ability?
Well, one thing, Damien, a lot of people don't actually like to be told that they're healthy agers or they're aging. So it is more, we would say, a personalisation piece, that people know that they will have higher requirements for different nutrients in their diet. As you say, they will have higher requirements for the protein piece as well.
Yeah.
And where are they going to reach for that, and how are they going to reach for it, and how are they going to bring it into their day parts as well? Because, you can tell someone to eat more protein, but if they're only having it at one part of the day as well, how do you break that down across the day parts so it's actually more digestible and they're getting the benefits from it as well? And, I think from a sports nutrition piece, that's very clear and we understand that, but also from a healthy aging piece, trying to bring that in and trying to break it down. And then, as we mentioned earlier as well, the higher omegas, higher DHAs, helping with that cognition piece, because we've seen that having larger portions of omegas within the diet at that age group will prevent against those diseases, like we mentioned, mild cognitive decline and Alzheimer's. So it's ensuring that we're positioning products that consumers will reach to, that have a good taste profile as well, that, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to take this product, you want to take it. And that's where the consumer insights come in, that we can understand the consumer by demographic, by region, and by age group as well.
Can I come in just on that, Damien? Because I think what Laura is saying is so important. A lot of times when we talk about healthy aging, traditionally the research was talking about people in their 50s and 60s. Yeah. Now, if you talk to people in their 50s and 60s now, they don't think, as Laura said, that they're aging at all. Yeah. But we are now at a point in time where we're going to have people that are well over 100. So when we're talking about the future of food, we're talking about how we sustain all of us as we, age over 100. So we're talking about 60 to 80 is one type of nutrition, 80 to 100 is another. But what about if I'm going to live to 120? How do I ensure I can live independently? And this kind of work around cognition and ensuring that we support our cognitive capabilities as we age is extremely important, because if we want to encourage people to eat, to train as they age, they need to be cognitively capable of understanding what we're trying to get them to do as well. So they're all kind of interlinked.
It seems like the population has some kind of literacy around omegas, that people understand that maybe they, and forgive a novice, they have some literacy around understanding that they should be either taking a fish oil supplement or eating, simple rule like eating an oily fish twice a week. Those kind of simple rules are in the system, so to speak, and I think people at least attempt to live by them. Is that enough? Or is there a wider opportunity for us to think about omegas in particular around this issue of cognitive health?
Yeah, I think particularly with something like omega-3 and DHA that Laura mentioned, which accumulates in the brain and we know is linked with cognition as we age. But that is a lifetime, also strategy that we should be considering. So if there are people tuning into this and they're in their 20s, their 30s, now is the time to be considering taking your omega-3s, for instance, and incorporating that into the diet and making that part of your routine, whether it is through oily fish, whether it is seeking out products that might be fortified with omega-3, whether it might be looking at an omega-3 supplement. But sometimes I think people package things into, I'm getting older, I will do that, when I'm 50 or 60 or whatever the case may be. Whereas introducing those habits, David spoke about, creating those habits, creating those motivations. People should be, trying to implement those from, as early as they can, really.
Yeah.
And we also have to be cognizant that some consumers don't necessarily eat fish. Some consumers would prefer an algae option as well. So it's creating accessible options that people will bring into their habits and routines, so that, when you're at the earlier ages and you're saying, look, I want to prevent this in the future, because we are an aging society and we are just going to get older as a society and a population. So, that proactive aging piece earlier on will protect in the future as well.
David, the people that you're dealing with, it seems that they live a glittering life for 10 years. I read recently a Premiership footballer can play 500 games, that's it. And then their performance starts to decline. And that's an average number, okay? Obviously some can play a lot more and some can play less. But it seems like you encountered the issue of physical aging the people like at a much younger age. This idea that Laura has introduced, that nobody old is always 10 years older than you are, even if you're 60, 70, 80, 90. How do we manage people through these transition, and what is the role of food, or how does the role of food change in those situations?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating the point you highlighted there. Actually, like, sport is that lifespan but condensed, because even as an athlete gets towards the latter stages of their career, their motivation to do all the little things to extend their career becomes a lot higher. They'll take the extra supplements, they'll do the extra prehabilitation side of things. And I think we're in a fortunate position in elite sport where, we have complete control of the physical and social environment. So we can restructure where things are. And I think, again, going back to human nature, we'll always look for the path of least resistance. So if things are as easy as possible and they're falling within my direct path on a daily basis, it becomes a lot easier to build those habits. So I think, as the products are becoming more accessible, and, if you look 10 years ago when it was something to do with, let's say, protein, the amount of foods now that have a higher protein content that you can incorporate into your daily life to hit those daily targets to help prevent age-related degenerative diseases have become a lot more convenient, and you can almost end up making that choice by default. But I still think the evolution of it, let's say, beyond sport, as the products are now there, I think it's bringing to life the implementation and understanding the paths people walk through on a daily basis, and then how we can, in many ways, script the critical steps for them. So if we want them to have, 4 decent servings of protein evenly distributed throughout the course of the day, from the second you walk into a building, how could step 1 be taken for you? And then the second you leave the building, maybe step 3 is already done, knowing that the lowest risk step is in the evening. So
designed into the workplace, designed into...
I think a lot of it is that.
Life,
I think it's, the core 3 things that'll influence human behavior are, someone's capability. We know that knowledge and education typically have some impact, but a very low impact on behavior.
Yeah.
But all of a sudden, if your physical environment is completely restructured, that the best choice is the easiest choice, and then also the peers around you are starting to do certain things, it's very easy for you to follow peer norms as opposed to start to create something completely new.
Yeah. Zane, how does the understanding of food change in the mind of people as they age, or does it? It seems to me that, older relatives eat much simpler diets, not necessarily healthier, but much simpler diets, which are easier to digest, which is a physical thing. But cognitively, how does the understanding of food amongst older people work?
Well, from a neuroscience point of view, we actually know that the neurons in the brain that regulate our feeding, so our appetite, for example, and also whether or not we feel full, they change with age. So you're battling biology in many respects, and so what can happen is that the neurons that tell you to, for example, you're full, they become quieter as you age, and that can be one of the things that promotes this age-related weight gain, for example. So I think it's very important to always think about biology in this kind of discussion as well. I think as we age, I see it with my parents and things like that. Part of it is like it was interesting what David said. If you have the best choice being the easiest choice. Now, I think as you get older, it's very hard for people to make that best choice, or to make the easiest choice the best choice. And what becomes, I guess, what happens when we age is that people just take the easiest option. I see that with my parents, and maybe that's something that we need to address.
I don't quite understand that they physically are unable to prepare food. Shopping is more difficult. Cooking for one person or 2 people is less rewarding. What exactly is the problem?
I think it's all of those, to be honest. I think there's the motivational aspect of getting up and doing it. There's also kind of that, what am I going to cook this time? I think there's studies, and people have somewhere between 7 and 10 recipes that they go on rotation, and every month they might look at a new recipe. And so I think these things come into our daily routine as we age. And I guess thinking about the future of food, we've got to think about how we can make it easier and more interesting for people as they age to try new things, try new foods.
Just picking up on that, I think that's a really interesting point, especially like you said about that repertoire. You know, people have that small group of things that they'll always default back to, and you know, their past behaviors are likely going to predict their future behaviors. I think one thing that would be really interesting to look at is what behaviors are kind of bundled. So on the days that somebody makes a better food choice, is there anything else that's happened that has led to that person wanting to make that food choice? Maybe it's the days that, you know, somebody exercises, motivation is a little bit higher, mood state is a little bit higher. And I think the concept of understanding what behaviors are bundled might give us more success or more clues to how we can design for that, because it is, I think what you've said is it's a real problem.
Can I also just say that I think the social aspect becomes very important here again, because when you invite people around to have dinner, you make the effort to think about what you're going to cook. You make the effort to think about whether it's not going to be nutritious and healthy, and again, so bundling, I guess, is what you're saying, David. In this concept, it's about how you prepare when you have people coming over and maintaining that social connection so that you can maintain those correct, healthy, nutritious choices.
Lisa?
Yeah, well, actually, I think that's a great point. And we know from studies, for instance, in nursing homes, that simply changing the food environment, you know, dressing the table, making it a more palatable environment, even not to mind the food, encourages people to eat more, which again is something that I think people often forget with aging. We talk a lot about people gain weight at a certain point in their lives, and they do. But people also significantly lose weight as they age, often at the expense of muscle. And one of the key aspects here is making foods that taste good, you know, making sure that there are flavours. We blunt our taste buds as we age, and there are actually differences between the sexes and how that happens as well. And we also need to consider that as people age, they will possibly be on a range of medications, and those medications also interact with food and also affect our taste. And I don't think that's spoken about enough. People don't often look at the small shifts that people make. So David has spoken about these behaviour changes, and it's often missed that these subtle shifts in people's behaviours happen when they go on medication, when they go through certain periods in life, but that can completely change the food profile. And then when you combine that with the fact that nobody is still targeting foods for older adults, packaging, for instance, that is easy to open if you have arthritis in your hands, if you're losing muscle mass. Some packaging is very difficult, particularly if you're living on your own. And making sure that those foods are in a portion that is energy dense, that is nutrient dense and attractive. You know, that's a whole area that I think hasn't been explored properly.
Do we have an exploration of the area of taste as you get older, in the sense, because there must be, if there's generic, as Zane has told, there's kind of generic tendencies towards certain foods when you're younger or an average person. As you get older, there must be some tastes which work for older people as well.
There's actually a lot that we're finding out. I mean, to be honest, Kerry have actually been brilliant in really looking at sensory profiles and how our sensory profiles change with age. I think, again, something that, you know, we've done some work on previously is also how that is different between men and women, which hasn't been explored enough, you know. But we do know a lot about sensory perception. Also, we learned a fair bit through COVID as well. You know, people with COVID lost their sense of taste and smell, and how we use flavour enhancers in a clever way to try and encourage eating.
Yeah, very good.
Can I go back to one thing, Zane?
Briefly,
I do wonder, listening to that as well, I feel like those flavour profiles, the food themselves, they feel like the controllables. Zane, I think your point about that social interaction is so important. Like, maybe the most effective intervention is actually looking at scheduling and structure in an elderly person's aging life. You know, what social communities do they still maintain? What activities are they still involved in? And then how does food feed into that?
Zane, I wanted to pick up on David's point and maybe to move to our second pool today, which is around GLPs, which I know you have particular expertise in. I think one of the issues around GLPs is that maybe people eat so much less and have such a reduced appetite for food that they no longer want to be so social for food, and that might be for 50% of the population. So I wonder where our GLPs where are GLPs headed? I mean, we've had the technology for 30 years, but this is the first generation of actual consumerization, I guess, of GLPs. Where are we going to be in 10 or 15 years? Where's the technology going to be in 10 or 15 years? What do you think that's going to look like?
Firstly, I'd say we know the biology of GLP-1, and we've known that for about 30 years. But the new drugs that we have, for example, Ozempic or Wegovy is one that most listeners would be aware of. We've really only had these in the last 3 or 4 years. And this is where they've done the modifications to the molecule to make it long lasting. So the half-life is somewhat around 160 hours, essentially a week. So people are on these, and I guess this comes back to what you mentioned at the beginning. And it's like you asked the question, why do we eat? And Laura talked about nutrition. She talked about pleasure, sociability. She talked about this idea of health maintenance, cognitive maintenance. Now, if we have these GLP-1s and they become pervasive in society, then I think it's only natural to expect that this could have an overarching effect on the pleasure that we get from our meals, the way in which we sit down with people and share meals. There have been lots of anecdotal stories of people sitting down to have dinner with their friend who's on Wegovy, for example, and they just push the food around the plate. And then they, by proxy, eat less because their friend is not eating as much. So there are all of these flow-on effects. At the moment, for GLP-1 and GLP-1 receptor agonists, we're focusing a lot on the medical benefits. And there are a lot of medical benefits, not only losing weight, but there's also changes to cardiovascular health, kidney health, all sorts of different things. And so we're really only focusing on those at the moment. And so your question for 10 or 15 years is going to be around how our mealtime looks, how sitting down with friends to share a meal looks. Those are the big questions, I think, for the future.
Is that an issue of portion size and food selection, that we go from, a 7 or 8 course tasting menu or a 3-course standard restaurant kind of menu to 1 course or smaller plates? What is your thoughts on that?
So again, just thinking about these drugs, they have anecdotally, again, when you talk to patients, they say they reduce the food noise. And so you stop thinking about food. Now, I certainly think from my own experience, sitting down to have a nice meal with friends, many courses, it's exciting and it's fun. And it's nice to try new things. And so what I could see in the future is that people are just maybe they're not going out so much to restaurants, who knows? But it certainly would be smaller portion size and maybe something like skipping lunch as well, or skipping dinner. So instead of having 3 meals, it might be 2 meals, something like that. Again, I've heard of people saying they've started these drugs, they wake up in the morning and they have no thoughts of food. They don't think about breakfast. They just get up and start their day. So, we could be looking at 2 healthy meals per day.
This reduction in noise, the last little section, we talked a lot about the social aspect of food. If you can reduce the noise, as Zane has called it, I really like that phrase. If you can reduce the noise, does that present an opportunity to introduce new noise about food? Or does it work like that? Is that a real opportunity for us?
Potentially. I mean, I think we're still really just at the start of beginning to learn what effect these drugs are going to potentially have.
Yeah.
For some individuals, I can see how that reducing the noise could certainly be a positive, because it's a real struggle for a large portion of society. Their relationship with food isn't positive.
Yeah.
And that can have significant psychological effects and impact all aspects of their life. But as Zane alluded to there, food is really pleasurable for the majority of people. I mean, if you look at the history of the human being, we have sat around. Food has been part of our culture, of our lives for years. And with the increase in technology and people using smartphones and everything, stopping for a meal is something that still people will do. I think as a society, if we're not going to be doing that, we need to think about how those social interactions are maintained. Food has had a positive impact in bringing communities together. And as David was discussing, when people age, bringing communities together to share meals could be an important factor in ensuring people age healthily. So I think that balance needs to be kind of looked at.
Yeah. Laura, the issue of aging and food is your special topic. It seems like we might end up with a whole bunch of healthier people coming to this old, whenever we haven't
Whenever
said
we
when
end
old
up
is
there,
yet, so let's be
Let's
careful
not
with
be
it.
rude.
I appreciate it. But it seems like we might have a whole bunch of healthier people coming to the age where, maybe retirement age 65 or 70, and they don't have fatty liver because GLPs seem to do something with that. They have less heart disease because GLPs do something with that. They have less diabetes. Is that, for you thinking about aging, is that something you're actually incorporating into your plans? Is this real for us right now?
Yeah, like the GLP-1, you would see patient or consumer is a fascinating area.
Yeah.
We've just come to an end of a body of market research with 2,600 consumers in the US. And what we saw was that you weren't just a GLP-1 consumer. They were very diverse. There was 5 profiles that came along with the GLP consumer. And in those different 5 profiles, they had different requirements and they could have different taste requirements. We saw that some of the profiles, they actually had a higher tendency for protein and less tendency for sweet. We saw that they obviously were eating less. But then we've also not spoken about the fact that these products do come with side effects. So there's a lot of nausea, there's gastric issues and so on. And at the start of this journey, we engaged with a lot of academics and stakeholders, physicians. We spoke to Zane, we spoke to a lot of people, spoke to Lisa. And we noticed there that these side effects actually cause discontinuation of the product. So, while we say it's fantastic, most people are generally on this for only about a year. And then you've got the maintenance phase after that. But then some people will need to be on it longer than a year as well. So we've actually kicked off clinical trials around GLP consumers and the gastric effects, because we've probiotics that can support with digestive issues, which will hopefully support them on their journey either for longer or post in the maintenance phase as well.
I understand that the negative impacts last for a period of time at the start, but it's because people keep going on and off.
Yeah, well, I suppose it's like any medication there as well. You do, compliance is very important at the start to ensure that you're going to get the benefit as well. But it generally is, I think that the benefits are seen around the 18-month mark, like for the full weight loss. But generally we're seeing people are dropping off about 60 to 80% at the year mark.
So at 18 months, you hit the plateau. That's
generally the goal target is around the 18 months of I think it's 15% body weight.
Do we have a sense what percentage of people stay on it for 18 months?
Well, if the percent dropping off is around 60%, so I imagine it's the remaining 40 that do see it.
It's kind of concerning, isn't it? That you've got a drug that seems to solve all of these problems, but people don't have the motivation, David, to stick with it. And it's back to your point earlier on about motivation, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I think relapse with anything is always something that any intervention, there needs to be a thought about what does the relapse prevention protocol look like? How long is that? And what maybe are the different steps that somebody needs to walk through? And it's, I find the psychological side of this also fascinating. Somebody can come in and really change their life for the better, but for some people that could change their life, and maybe they, psychologically it could have impacts that we don't know yet as well. And I think on the social side, that's a slightly worrying piece as well. Like if somebody is avoiding social settings, and it's from that side of things, I find the long-term solution is still probably a bit more multifaceted. And I think if somebody goes in for bariatric surgery, they're going to have to go through some sort of psychological profiling before, so that they know what changes could happen, what to expect. And I'm not as aware of that level of profiling that occurs around the implementation of these drugs.
Yeah. Thanks, Lisa.
Just to also say, Zane mentioned that these drugs seem to get rid of the food noise, but food noise isn't the only thing that leads to unhealthy behaviours. And if it's great to have a drug that actually potentially can help people, but if you don't understand how somebody got to that position in the first place, that's still only impacting one facet of what might actually help to improve their lives. So I can see why people stop taking it, for some individuals, because the reason that maybe that they had gained weight or that they had these unhealthy behaviours are above and beyond just the foods they were consuming. There are other aspects of their lives that would need to be examined.
That with the regain as well, because we know a large percentage in that maintenance phase, as it's called, actually regain a lot of the weight that they've lost. So if you're not addressing the fundamentals like the behavioural aspects or the social aspects, because they are what drive us as population, we'll never get a true kind of resolution of this
And
crisis.
I saw this thing recently where some celebrity was talking about the fact they'd lost their bum, you know, while they were on this drug. But actually, from an exercise point of view, all I was thinking was there's large muscle mass loss.
Yeah, it's muscle that you've lost there, yeah.
And what are the implications for that then, you know, because the one thing that we're trying to do as people age is maintain muscle mass, and it's great to have a drug that may help and support people, but if it's going to be at the expense of muscle, then that needs to be managed.
I think on that as well, I think it's and I don't know if the research on this, I'm sure, or I feel like my assumption would be, if you ask somebody, do you want to take this drug for the rest of your life? They would like to say no, that they would like to use it and get back to being themselves and doing the things that they like and love. And exactly like that, you know, significant loss of muscle mass, loss of function, if they know it's at the trade-off of, can I get up and down the stairs effectively? You know, that's where I think, you know, for me personally, and I'll always have a bias towards this, you know, we always, you know, and especially from sport, we want to help people understand what they can do to live a healthier life. You know, what behaviours can they bring to life, how they exercise, eat, sleep. But, you know, maybe for some people it's necessary, but I would like to think that eventually they'll
Let's come back to that in just 1 second. Zane, do you have a sense of, please.
Yeah, I was going to say that the obesity problem is huge. And, you know, David's point is excellent. But I think, you know, the mass scale of trying to address the problem makes it hard to create behavioral change for everybody. And so we're talking about 2 billion people that are currently above 30 BMI, so considered obese. So, you know, we need these pharmacological solutions. And we shouldn't lose fact that they are having a very strong medical benefit. There is obviously very, very important concerns about long-term effects because studies haven't gone longer than 3 or 4 years. There's a lot of psychological issues, for example. I think Lisa was talking about this idea of addressing what caused you to consume so much food to get you to that point in the first place. And I think some people have mentioned they ate because of some trauma, and then they got on these drugs, and then they had to face the trauma head on and actually address it and get counselling, all those things. So all these things, I guess, need to come together. And we still need to consider that this drug is out there and it's a benefit for billions of people. And if that makes us healthier, if that makes society better, and if that has an economic benefit for society, then I think that's a good thing. So but we do have to consider long-term issues, obviously.
When you say billions of people, it gives us just some sense of the scale and impact that it has on the global population. Zane, do you have a sense, to David's point about the willingness of consumers or citizens to stay on this drug for the very, very long term? Laura talked about the dropout rate, but that's a different issue, I think. When people start on this drug, are they in principle willing to stay on it for their lives, like they are with a blood pressure medication or a cholesterol medication, or do people see it as something temporary?
Yeah, that's a really hard one. I don't think people fully understand the idea of taking it forever. And certainly people want the weight loss effects, but when they go on it for a long period of time, my understanding and of talking to people that have been on it, it is a massive burden to try and adhere to this. Not only with the gastrointestinal problems that it can cause and the nausea, and people have, you know, different responses. But it's also this idea around why we eat again and coming back to pleasure and sociability and just a general change in their mood.
David, if there is an off-ramp from GLPs, it probably is in your area of personalized nutrition, where a person would be able to get a recommendation for diet, for exercise. And you described to me before we started about there being an arms race in wearables. I mean, we've all got wearables on today of some kind or another, which are telling us all kinds of things. How far are we from a situation whereby, you know, I get up in the morning and I get a message from Apple that says, hey, listen, you had a great night's sleep last night. You could do 10 minutes extra exercise today. And by the way, have eggs for your breakfast instead of Cocoa Pops or whatever How far are we from that, or am I thinking about this in the right way?
No, well, I think with that specific example, we're there today. Is the honest answer. So it's not even like a how long. It's a, you know, we've got different wearable devices on. You know, some of them have things that they're better at than others. Some of them definitely have drawbacks and things that they're getting wrong. But ultimately, what they are doing is they are taking, real-time data from our sleep, from our exercise, and from our sort of daily lifestyle activity, and then making recommendations about what we should do next. So I think what we're seeing in the wearable space right now is a movement more from data capture and sort of retrospectively telling people what they've done into using that information to then make a recommendation or a prediction as to what you should do next. I think we're seeing that mostly in the wearable space now around physical activity. I think nutrition has lagged behind. It's something that we're actively and pushing on at Hexus from our side.
Why is it lagging? Is it difficulty of recording, or is it difficulty of equivalence, or why is the nutrition side lagging?
I would say everyone has to eat, everyone has to sleep, and everyone has to move.
Yeah.
I would say capturing data passively is a lot easier sleeping. You can wear a wrist-based or a ring-based device, and it's very easy to capture high resolution, some resolution better than others. Again, some things that they're still doing wrong, but still provide feedback. I still think when you're looking at nutrition and people are sort of manually tracking what they are eating, that's high friction, that's high effort.
Yeah.
There's things that are improving that at a rate of knots. People can now, we can send voice notes. Certainly from our side of things, we just let people send a voice note. We can capture what they've had at breakfast, automatically map that against a database, and then sort of verify to the best of the ability, what based on the information they've given us, what they've had.
Yeah.
Computer vision is coming in as well.
Yeah.
But again, I think that there's a really interesting thing sort of underlying it all, and going back to sort of Zane, what you said about that 7 to 10 meals that people typically have. The best predictor of future behavior is typically past behavior. So there's certain days, certain times, people are going to go back to the same things. And if you're sort of I think for us now, they're kind of existing in silos. Nutrition is over here, sleep and exercise are over here. I think the big jump, and probably in the next year, in reality, is those two coming together, where actually you're seeing the integration of those various data sources into then making a recommendation about what to do next and how it marries up.
So is it like GLPs in the sense that you've got to do this forever? Or is it that you would do it periodic, like, you would, I don't mean you have a good month and a bad month kind of thing. I'm thinking as a normal person here. If you're a super athlete, you're Mo Salah, it's a different story, right? But is it like, I have 5 good days and 2 bad days, or like, what is the extent of behavioral change that's actually possible in your experience? And what is the role that these wearables and personalized nutrition plays in that?
So I think a massive assumption that everyone's making is exactly that you're going to do this forever. And I think what people are, a way I like to think about it is on a much more simplistic level. I think let's say there's level 1, people who need to do, they're making bad choices. They just need to make some better choices. Then you kind of have a level 2, you're making better choices most of the time, but you're still enjoying yourself, every now and again. And then level 3 might be when things get quite intense. I'm very focused on, sticking exactly to my plan. I think the way we need to think about it is how we periodize somebody's year, that there will be times that it's more important for them to focus more. And then there will be times that it's more important for them to be more relaxed, but let's say maintain a certain level. And I actually think that's where the future of all of this is going, is actually understanding how to periodize intensity of interventions as well to support somebody at the various time points.
So how close are we to me being able to go into a store, whether it's a branded store that we've already mentioned, some brands, and buying a device? I assume it's going to be a watch or a ring or something that's technology. How far are we from being able to buy a piece of technology and an app that does what you just said?
So I think, it's what we're trying to build at Hexus from our side of things. We're already integrating these various data sources and making these recommendations. I think the individual apps or individual pieces of technology are out there, the biometric rings, wrist straps, etc. In terms of everything coming together and looking at exactly what you should do based on exactly what's happened, I think we're less than 24 months. I realistically think it's 12 to 24 months. And it's at the same time, if you look at the rate of evolution of, let's say, AI, and artificial intelligent agents towards AGI, you know, it's happening at the same time that these tools are rapidly being developed. So there's an integration of these at the same time that's making that sort of coaching layer a lot more accessible, a lot faster than we previously thought it was.
Yeah.
And
Or
it's
this is
looking
maybe,
at, it's looking at this holistically as well.
Yeah.
Because when we're talking about weight management, that's one piece. If you're thinking about sleep, how many hours of sleep you're getting, how well rested you are, that's also going to influence your cognitive ability. If your cognitive ability is influenced, your decision power is also going to be influenced. Like we know, we can see, and you mentioned it really well, that, you know, if you compartmentalize the protein across the day, the later decisions tend to be weaker because your decision power is down, and you tend to say at that point, well, I'll go for the treat rather than you're tired. And, you know, looking at this holistically and saying, well, am I sleeping better? You know, could I be supplementing in a way that helps me sleep better? You know, you'll see a huge rise now in things like magnesium for sleep. You know, ashwagandha also helps in terms of sleep ability and stress and reduction of stress. And that all is another way of looking at this from holistic, because when we talk about a GLP consumer, they might be 12 months of a story. But you've also got the person who hasn't been taking it and maybe doesn't want to. And then you've also got the maintenance. So looking at this not just from a weight loss decision, but looking at holistically the consumer, the social norm, the sleep, the day parts, and the demographic.
So it has a cognitive potential as well from your perspective.
Yeah, to look at the whole story holistically, because again, if you're stronger cognitively, you're going to be stronger in your decision power and help you on that journey as well.
Lisa, the issue of concussion, I just think, is such a serious area. I wanted to ask you a serious question about this. Is that sometimes when I go up in the morning, my watch says to me, you slept for 9.5 hours. I didn't sleep for 9.5 hours because I was awake watching TV till 2 a.m. Now, maybe I was lying there quietly. Like, if we're going to make these kinds of very big decisions based on a device, what kind of scientific confidence do you have in the ability of devices today, or as you see it in the next 2 years or 3 years, to actually gather this data accurately and advise us accurately, as opposed to going to see a professional or your GP?
Yeah, look, I think you always need to know the limitations of what's currently available. That's not to say that things, you know, as David said, aren't accelerating at a rate of knots. But, you know, when it comes to sleep data, certainly when we're dealing with athletes, the first thing you'd always ask an athlete one question in the morning: what dreams did you have? What do you remember about the dream? Because that actually straight away, far better than any device, tells you how well they slept. It tells you if they were in a deep sleep. And that one question...
So dreams are better.
Yeah, if you remember anything about a dream, it tells you about, you know, the depth of the sleep. I will have had plenty of people who will have a watch that has told them that they've slept very well, and they come in and they're exhausted. And you say, did you sleep well? And he said, well, my watch said I slept well, but did you sleep well? How do you feel rested? They're not synonymous. And so I think sometimes the data and the wearables are actually fantastic and they can really be supportive, but you can't just say that this is the sole decision on whether actually somebody is healthy, not healthy, or has slept well. With sleep as well, and I think, again, you mentioned you're watching TV into the wee hours. Devices can be detrimental to sleep. You know, we say half an hour, put your phone away half an hour before you go to bed. That light actually keeps the brain active. Laura's talking about cognition. Cognitive rest is extremely important. So if you're driven by devices, if you have a laptop in your room, if you're looking at a phone before you go to sleep, all of those impact your sleep. And when we deal with elite athletes, we have sleep protocols for them. There are things they're not allowed, you know, they're not allowed to have devices. There's a whole sleep hygiene routine that they go into. So those kind of things are important for the everyday individual as well, to get good quality sleep. And sleep impacts all of our food choices during the day. So if we think about trying to tie in the foods that we recommend, sleep behaviour is extremely important.
Zane, do you think that these wearable devices have the potential to shape our cognitive behaviour over the long term? Or is it, I think what Dave is saying, you can do it for shorter periods of time, no problem, focus kind of periods. Is that, what's the cognitive thing look like from your side?
I mean, that's a very hard thing to answer. I think people who take or wear these or want to use these often have that strong desire to do so. And so they'll pay attention to the data. Some people may be just outsourcing their decision making to the device. I think Lisa was alluding to that. But I think I think the research tells us if we're aware of what's going on, if we get that feedback, then we know and we have something to act on. And a key principle of learning is getting feedback. Okay, and so if we can see that we've walked 10,000 steps or done 10,000 steps today, or 15,000, however many it is, that can often give us that little boost, that little spike of dopamine that can then help us do it again. And of course, all of this is going to have a cognitive benefit over the long term, I think. I just wanted to say one thing in response to what Lisa was saying in terms of biology. Sleep, there are sleep neurons in our brain. Now, there are, and these neurons also play an important role for food intake. So obviously sleep and food intake don't go well together. So you have to be awake to eat, and the way in which our brain can regulate these processes, so that the parts of the brain that are controlling food intake are suppressing parts of the brain that are important for sleep. And so there is actually, again, biological basis for how these things work, which I find fascinating.
Lisa, we have a couple of minutes left. I wanted to come to maybe, I don't know whether it's the biggest issue of our time. It's such an interesting conversation this morning. But the issue of ultra high processed foods, and then the issue of reformulation, it seems like we may be, with some political movement in the United States, be actually facing, maybe for the first time since the Second World War, a period of significant reformulation of food. Are you seeing the same thing? And what direction do you think that might take, or what direction would you like it to take?
Yeah, I suppose if we take them separately to start off with, ultra processed foods or ultra high processed foods, that a lot of people speak about them in negative terms and speak about processing only in negative terms, but the processing of food in itself is not necessarily a negative. So I think the two need to be looked at separately. Firstly, there are some parts of society where 80% of their diets come from ultra-processed foods, and they play an important role. Yeah. And as soon as you, I suppose, bash heavily processed foods, there are certain socioeconomic groups for whom it's very difficult for them not to consume those foods. So to separate out, firstly, processing, as a factor, and then also nutrient profiles as a factor, because they're not the same thing. And, we still don't have the studies to conclusively tell us that diets that are high in ultra-processed foods automatically lead to negative health consequences. Now, we can surmise that, of course, foods that are very high in saturated fat, that are high in sugar, etc., that they can have negative health consequences. But certainly reformulation can have a role to make sure that the nutrient profiles of these ultra-processed foods are more favourable, that we can ensure, like fortification still plays an important role. Changing the nutrient profiles of food is extremely important. I think to say that we would completely get rid of ultra-processed foods isn't realistic, because they do have a role. Obviously, we would prefer if people were eating natural, if people were going to be preparing their meals and there were very few, we'll say, additives in their foods. But that's not the reality for a lot of individuals in society, and we have to be fair and give recommendations and support all members of society.
Yeah. Laura, when you're in your commercial as well as your scientific work, are you seeing pressure towards this reformulation or anticipation of reformulation? Or
I suppose regulations are something that have always come down the line in different regions. And generally regulations offer opportunity in terms of innovation. So this could be an opportunity to innovate with different ingredients, natural flavours. Yeah. It doesn't necessarily mean a bad thing. It is just helping reformulate and then help the consumer, as well.
Yeah. Zane, you talked about these high density foods and high calorie foods. If they were suddenly off the market, what would people replace them with?
Yeah, well, that's a $64 billion question.
Yeah, I mean, would it be psychologically a great difficulty for people if they couldn't have? I don't want to pick out a particular product because, as Lisa said, it's not a product. But would people be bereft if certain products weren't available, or suddenly had a taste and nutrition formula that was different to what they've been used to since childhood? Would that be a big psychological difficulty for people?
Yeah, that's going to affect the wiring in the brain for sure, because the brain learns cues around your regular feeding patterns and all those sorts of things. So there is going to need to be some rewiring going on in the brain. My first thought was actually, if you're depriving someone of their regular source of pleasurable food, that's going to be impacting their motivation and reward system. What is going to replace that? So it's likely to have some kind of psychological effect. Again, trying to supplement that, if you take that away, you would want to try and supplement that with something that's going to maintain that dopamine hit from something else.
Yeah. David, we've got 30 seconds. You're taking rewards away from these super athletes all the time. What do they replace it with? I mean, with victory, I presume, or the opportunity of victory, but what about for ordinary people?
I think we often look at, like, again, with processed foods, people will say things are good or bad.
Yeah.
And I actually think that it's taking a step back from that. And we like to classify things as appropriate or inappropriate based on what somebody's actually done.
Yes.
Somebody goes out and rides a stage of the Tour de France, they've been in the saddle for 5.5 hours. If they want, a can of Coke and something that's incredibly full of sugar, they will absolutely, but it's appropriate.
Yeah.
There's a depleted glycogen store and there's a need to replenish that. So I think it's, what we do in our day-to-day life varies every day. Our activity levels, the amount we do, and I think we need to start to adjust our intake in line with the demands
Sitting
of
at your
activity.
desk and having a can of Coke and a Mars bar at 3 o'clock every afternoon.
Probably inappropriate.
Not a great idea.
Yeah.
Friends, thanks for joining our discussion today. It's been terrific. You can clearly see we can talk for much longer, but thank you for joining this Kerry Health and Nutrition Institute webinar. We hope to see you again next time. And on your behalf, I'll thank Laura, David, Lisa and Zane, and thank you again for being with us. We really appreciate it.